Northeast Arkansas, the regional airport between Walnut Ridge and Pocahontas. On a day not unlike this one, in the early 1940s, the morning quiet would disappear in the roar of planes, scores of them warming up. And Charles Reed would have been warming up his plane too. He was a teenager then and mechanic on a BT-13 trainer like this one.
Yeah, they had to be ready to go by the time they got the pilots out here about 7, something like that.
Others with a connection to the Walnut Ridge Army Flying School have turned out, like the fighter pilot who was a cadet here, or the man who flew 29 combat missions over Europe in a heavy bomber. There's even a grandmother who once was the teenaged sweetheart of a cadet. They're members of what's been called the greatest generation, the Americans who helped save democracy during World War II.
That is me. Several years ago.
And Stanley Rames can go up again in the same kind of plane from his basic training days all those years ago. And no one cares that it's painted in Navy colors. The reunion is a project of the Walnut Ridge Army Flying School Museum. The museum is in a little brick building near the main runway.
Soldiers came in by convoy. So there they are getting out of the big, they'd haul them in like that. The first group came in from Mississippi. Like that.
A new museum with a lot more space will be ready soon. The idea is to preserve the stories connected to this place. Like the story of Stanley Rames. He was maybe 19 when he came here, went on to pilot P-51 Mustangs, the Cadillac of American fighters during World War II, was shot down over Germany on his 50th mission, was a prisoner of war for a year, but on this day was a kid again in a trainer that helped send him on his way.
Oh, yeah. Even let me fly it for a while. Gee, it felt so good.
I'm Jack Hill. Arkansas played an important role in the nation's response to World War II, and nowhere is that more evident than at the Army Flying School between Walnut Ridge and Pocahontas.
Wings of Honor.
The street, about 400 feet, is where the guardhouse
and the reunion continues.
Now, once we make this turn to the left up here, if you'll look off to the right, you'll see one of the original hangars, a double bay hangar that was built in 1942. The green buildings represent mess halls, so there were 8 mess halls on the airfield.
But when news of the flying school began to circulate in April of 1942, it's doubtful local folks had any idea what was coming. What was coming would change everything.
Well, with the whole community was Northeast Arkansas and Southeast Missouri was blessed by the government picking this area.
Construction work for the school began in June on a sprawling site of nearly 3,100 acres.
Well, you couldn't believe how fast this thing went up and how many. Today you'd see a whole group of barracks. Tomorrow you'd see 2 groups of barracks.
And people flooded into the area to take the jobs that suddenly were available.
They said, "You've been hired." Said, "When can you go to work?" And we said, "Well, tomorrow or next day, a week, or whatever." They said, "How about this afternoon at 4 o'clock?"
All this was a big change for folks who had been struggling in the Depression.
You could quit one job today and go to work the next day, you know, someplace, and that's the way it was. This was me.
Maybe 1,500 people altogether came for the new jobs. Local communities strained to accommodate them.
My mother and dad kept a couple of people out in rural Arkansas without a bathroom or running water and so on and so forth. They were just glad to get a place to stay and work out here in the construction of it.
The airfield was activated on August 15, 1942. And now the military personnel began to arrive in droves.
The barracks, they were tar paper, I call them tar paper shacks. The streets weren't paved or anything, and the sidewalks, you walked on wood sidewalks. And if you got off of them, You was in mud.
By the time the flying school was up and running in October of 1942, less than 4 months after construction began, there could be as many as 5,000 people out here, more than the populations of Walnut Ridge and Pocahontas combined. There was a WAC detachment, a unit of the Women's Army Corps, and more blacks than area people had ever seen before, segregated in separate units in keeping with the practice of that time.
Well, I was raised on a farm, and I didn't have a chance to see a lot of black people because we wasn't in our community.
Gradually, the muddy roads were paved, and better housing was put in for civilians who worked and lived on the base, dormitories even.
So anyhow, I rented one of those rooms, and there were girls here from Paragould, Jonesboro, Pocahontas, Walnut Ridge even. And there were some cadet wives that lived there also. And we had a house mother that was there.
At the Methodist Church in Walnut Ridge, a Saturday night fun time was organized.
The boys just flocked in there. We were astonished. We didn't do any social dancing there in those days, but just about everything else. And it was really astounding how many came.
But at the old courthouse in Pocahontas, there was social dancing. The place was turned into a recreation center for the troops, and Mike Dunn remembers it. His mother was a hostess, and he spent a lot of time here.
This was the main ballroom here, and if I remember right, the jukebox set over in this corner. From the ceiling hung a big plaster of Paris ball with mirrors on it. And there were colored lights in each one of the corners, and they were different colors. And the ball turned, and that light would reflect off of those mirrors with different colors.
Andy Fair and his wife Lucille would meet on the very first night the place was open.
One of the, I don't know, I guess you'd call her the city mothers, sort of recruited me to go there as hostess.
And I thought, well, I'll just go in and have a few drinks. I met her here, and I never did get that first drink.
And they went on to get married in the post chapel. To say the soldiers were welcome to Pocahontas and Walnut Ridge would be an understatement.
It was a custom that every Sunday you would take one of these guys or two or whatever and have them for dinner. We called it dinner at that time. Now, a lot of times they weren't used to the Southern food, but many of them got used to it.
And then there was all that correspondence involving Reverend Bearden.
I had mothers write me and say, would you please have one of your ladies bake a cake and take it to our boy? And we did that a great many times.
Few of the original buildings from the flying school remain. The post commander's house is still here. So is the chapel. It's now on the campus of Williams Baptist College. The college sits on more than 100 acres of what used to be the flying school. That double bay hangar has been added onto and is used now for a manufacturing plant. But the runways still look pretty much as they did. And oh, the memories.
It was a good time for a lot of people here. It brought them out of the Depression.
The BT-13 was the most widely used trainer for American forces during World War II. Shortly before the plane came into service, the chief of the Air Corps said in 1939 that America's air arm was 5th or 6th rate. And this plane and the men who flew it aimed to change that as the United States played catch-up at the beginning of World War II.
So I was flying 6 hours a day in that rear seat of that cockpit, which was a dangerous place to be with a cadet taking off and landing.
James Brackett was an instructor at the flying school.
Some of us didn't have much more experience than the people we were teaching, but we had to get them out in a hurry.
You either fly in the morning or in the afternoon, and another group of instructors fly the other half of the day.
Hundreds of flights would launch into this airspace on a typical day, often 7 days a week.
Sometimes to come back in and land, you would have to travel 25 miles away from here and get in a line and follow that line in to land on the runway. So big traffic jam in the air, and that's why they had those auxiliary fields.
There were 5 of them. At Biggers, Beech Grove, Walcott, Bono, and Pocahontas. They're fading from memory now, but not the field at Pocahontas. It's still used as the city's airport. A 5-county area was divided into sections to help provide some control over all this flying school activity.
Wasn't unusual to see, just look out to the east and see 4 or 5 airplanes flying in formation.
But it was in Area 5, the place for acrobatics, where the planes really made an impression, like around Clover Bend.
And you'd have those planes come and they'd get low. They wouldn't be more than treetop high, and you could see their faces. They'd wave at you or whatever.
Local people still were farming pretty much like the pioneers, but all those planes were an indication this was about to change.
I remember picking cotton and flying so low I could have thrown a cotton bowl maybe and hit one of them.
And the Catholic Church in Pocahontas figures in some of those low passes too. Brackett had come down from the north and met the Southern girl on post who had become his wife. And then during church on Sunday, he had come along in that BT-13.
So when I got right over the church, I could put it into high gear where it would go, really churned, didn't it? Anyway, that let her know that I was still here.
And Jim always seemed to time it just in the middle of the sermon. I was a little embarrassed, but I was very pleased too. You know, you're flattered.
Out on the flight line, boys who'd known nothing but farm work found themselves maintaining airplanes. Now there could be something beyond the farm.
Actually, when you stop to think about it, there's a lot of education into it. We learned a lot different from what we'd been raised as a farm family.
And this was different. It was known as the Link Trainer, a flight simulator for cadets.
They'd learn to fly instruments on this, and then once they got fairly proficient in this, then they'd go to the airplane and fly instruments there.
Harold Johnson, by the way, is president of the Walnut Ridge Army Flying School Museum. And the Link Trainer was safe. No men were lost in them. Lots of men were in plane crashes.
All of a sudden, a parachute come out of it, and then it went into a tailspin, and it crashed down on Crossroads just below our farm.
And this particular airplane was troublesome in a spin, because you go up to a certain altitude to do acrobatics. You can't do a spin unless you're at 1,500 feet or higher if you expect to get out of it.
Planes came down in fields. Pilots in trouble aimed for roads and missed. They crashed into trees, practically in people's backyards.
And I let out a big scream, and my mother looked up, and everybody else did too. And my mother said, "You're not supposed to be here." And I just kept screaming and pointing. And some man in military uniform or dress came over there, and he said, "She's found the student. This little girl has found the student."
More than 40 men, cadets and instructors at the flying school, would be killed.
And there was probably more pilots washed out here in Walnut Ridge or in BT basic training than any other stage of their flying.
But we didn't know how long we were going to last, because ever so often they were washing one out here and washing one out there and washing another one. And so we were wondering if we were going to make it.
But most of the cadets who came here for basic flight training did make it, nearly 5,000 altogether, and they would go on to fight and fly in every theater of the war. Retired aircraft at Universal Asset Management, the regional airport. Bit by bit, piece by piece, the folks here take apart airplanes. Big jets literally will disappear. What is salvaged can be worth thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands. But there was a time when the salvage operation here almost was beyond belief. It was one of the largest concentrations of airplanes ever at one place at one time. After World War II, thousands of military planes were flown to what had been the Army Flying School.
But they were so busy that they turned over to me, and I was nothing but a clerk in there, to sign for these incoming planes. And I'd have a stack of papers 2 or 3 inches high.
And then they'd bring them in and start removing the propellers and the engines. In this engine you had aluminum, magnesium, silver, platinum, and all that had to be separated out. When they get through, they tow it to the chopping block and chop the airplane up with a large blade and crane. They'd push this aluminum then into the air smelter, lower the door, and melt the aluminum. We'd tap it into molds in 1,200-pound ingots.
I'll never forget standing at the window and watching those B-32s flying in. They were on their maiden flight from Willow Run, just to come in here to be chopped up.
We had no automobiles, we had no washing machines, we had no refrigerators. We were returning this aluminum back to the consumers, and they needed it. We had no further need for all these airplanes. They had accomplished their purpose.
A lot of people had cushions that were taken out of the planes. And in fact, one of the first Razorback games, a fellow here in town got all these cushions, went down in Little Rock and took them down there and rented them out.
The salvage operation lasted for a couple of years. But the story of this place is not really about airplanes. It's about people, like Leslie Hood and Jean. He was a cadet at Walnut Ridge who did his primary flight training at Cape Girardeau, Missouri, where she lived. More than 60 years later, and Jean still remembers clearly how they met, quite by accident, as she was walking home. They sat on the front porch and talked. She was 16, he was 22.
And Mother and Dad had always said that I couldn't date cadets. We had many cadets at the Scott airfield doing their primary training. And Mother said, but we can invite him over for a meal. So they invited him over for Sunday dinner. And anyway, they liked him. I think we dated for 6 weeks. And then he went to Walnut Ridge.
And so the letters began. The first was written from Walnut Ridge on July 16, 1943.
And I wasn't sure that he would even write to me. But he did.
And she's kept them all, every letter.
And I think he was glad to have a girlfriend to write to. And I was that girlfriend.
The next letter was dated August 20th, 1943. Les was hoping there was a way he could get back to Cape Girardeau to see her. It didn't work out. Now he's writing from Freeman Field at Seymour, Indiana, where he's commissioned a second lieutenant after advanced flight training in twin-engine planes.
And I waited for those letters. I looked for those letters, and I was thrilled when I would receive a letter from him. And I'd read it and reread it.
Then letters come from Lake Charles Army Airfield in Louisiana. Les will be a co-pilot on a B-26 bomber, and Jean is wondering if she'll ever see him again. By the letter of April 14, 1944, Les knows he's going overseas for combat. A year is a long time to go without seeing a pretty girl, he writes, and asks her to wait for him until he returns.
Well, I read that, and he, in a way, he was thinking about marriage.
And he adds, I'll be thinking of you all the time.
I think he knew that I cared for him very, very much.
And she will wait for him. Next comes a letter from somewhere in West Africa, May 2nd, 1944. Somewhere in England, May 11th, 1944.
When Les flew the southern route to England, one of the stops was in Brazil, and he bought a little brooch for me. He sent it to his father, and his father sent it on to me. And it was just very special that his father did write.
Somewhere in North Ireland, May 17, 1944. Somewhere in France, September 1st. Everyone realizes Les is now flying combat missions in a B-26. He's with the 394th Bomb Group of the 9th Air Force.
And I tried to read in the paper, and I would, of course, read in the Cape Girardeau paper, and there was never very much about the 9th Air Force.
The B-26 was the primary medium bomber used by Army Air Forces in Europe during World War II. It had a range of more than 1,000 miles, a bomb load of 4,000 pounds, and a top speed of nearly 300 miles per hour. A clipping arrives from Mr. Hood in January 1945 that indicates Les has been promoted to first lieutenant, has completed 33 missions, has been awarded the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. There's a note from Les on January 24th from London, where he's getting a break from combat. And then the letters stop coming. On March 14, 1945, Mr. Hood writes Jean, "This is the hardest thing. Leslie is missing in action over Germany since February 21st. No other details." Jean got the letter on a day that should have been a happy one.
And that afternoon, I was being initiated into the Literary Society, which was Cape Girardeau's substitute for sororities. And I got this letter. And, of course, I didn't make it that afternoon. I was just, didn't know, I was just distraught.
And now her letters to Les are returned and marked missing in action.
But we did have some hope that he was a prisoner of war. And they knew that, I guess, 4 or 5 parachutes had come down. Missing is one thing. Killed in action or deceased is something else. You always have hope. Always have hope.
But on May 28, 1945, Mr. Hood writes, "There is no way to break bad news gently. Leslie is not coming back."
That was the worst, because we had hope. I've always felt so sorry for them. Of course, he was their only child, and I always felt sorry for myself, but I felt more sorry for them.
But Les did come back. His remains were buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in June of 1949, more than 4 years after the war in Europe was over. And Jean still visits his gravesite. First Lieutenant Leslie Hood, shot down over Germany on his 50th combat mission. Their story is but one of thousands connected to the Army Flying School between Pocahontas and Walnut Ridge. This is Jack Hill reporting for Arkansas.
Wings of Honor.